After the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ as he was called, took over the presidency. He had a reputation as a wheeler and a dealer, since he'd served in Congress for so long prior to becoming JFK's running mate and vice president. Since he had been passed over for the presidency in 1960, he was determined to prove that he was just as liberal as JFK had been. And he immediately began a campaign to make the United States a model democracy for the whole world to copy, developing his domestic program called the Great Society, a large portion of which would include programs to end discrimination and poverty, since about 20% of all Americans lived in poverty at the time LBJ became president. This was seen as a particularly significant issue because of the publication of a book by a modern-day muckraker named Michael Harrington titled The Other America. As part of his Great Society, there would be numerous anti-poverty measures, including a food stamp program and programs to help people find work. Other key parts of the Great Society included the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed racial discrimination and created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It tried to eliminate restrictions on black voting, such as the use of poll taxes and literacy tests, and it included the Economic Opportunity Act that was designed to help disadvantaged Americans improve their lives. As part of that act, Congress enacted Medicare, a hospital insurance program for the elderly and the poor, Head Start programs to prepare children from disadvantaged areas for their education, Job Corps, providing employment for disadvantaged youths in the inner city, and VISTA, which was kind of a domestic version of the Peace Corps. Also, almost immediately after assuming the presidency, LBJ would be on the campaign trail in his own right, since the election of '64 was just around the corner. He was nominated by the Democratic Party to run against the Republican Barry Goldwater, who was depicted in television ads as a bit of a hothead and likely to land the United States in a nuclear war. And Goldwater himself had been quoted as saying, "Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice," using his own words against him. In that fall election in 1964, the vote would be overwhelmingly in favor of LBJ, earning more than 61% of the popular vote, something no candidate since has accomplished, although Nixon did come close in 1972. Returning back to the civil rights movement by the 1960s, civil rights, in particular desegregation, had become a significant political issue. Going back to the Kennedy versus Nixon presidential race, JFK had spoken out on the campaign trail about freedom and constitutional rights, and after being elected, he had promised that desegregation would be a top priority of his administration, which is part of the reason why he appointed his brother, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General. He had challenged the younger generation to make a difference and get involved, and many did. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King's nonviolent strategy was beginning to be put to its first major test. Early in 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, set out on a bus tour to challenge the existence of segregated areas in bus terminals and locations throughout the South. It started with 13 college students, 7 black and 6 whites, who would travel through the heart of the South, purposely disobeying local laws, to focus attention on racial bigotry. The Freedom Rides began in Virginia, and at first riders simply received dirty looks and racist comments, but otherwise there were no significant problems. But in Charlotte, North Carolina, Freedom Riders were arrested for entering an all-white barbershop. When they reached South Carolina, some of them were beaten, and there were more arrests. In Georgia, KKK members holding tire chains and clubs ambushed the Greyhound bus on which they were traveling. 12 of the riders were seriously injured, and one of the buses was set on fire. When the bus finally reached Birmingham, Alabama, an angry mob surrounded it. Many of the Freedom Riders, including those who were white, were dragged from the buses and beaten with lead pipes. 3 were hospitalized in serious condition, and 1 died. But the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality decided to continue the Freedom Ride because they felt they should not allow violence to hinder their cause. And so the Freedom Ride continued to Mississippi, where the bus was shot at twice and had its windows broken by flying bricks, though there were no serious injuries. Officials had promised police escorts, but none were present. And the Freedom Riders would all be arrested once they arrived in Mississippi for violating segregation laws, though there would be no injuries as had happened in Alabama. And the American public was shocked. In the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama was called the most segregated city in the United States. And Martin Luther King had once stated, "If we can break Birmingham, we can break the South." Eugene Connor, Bull Connor, the police commissioner in Birmingham, vowed that civil rights marchers would never take over his city. And to prevent such actions, the city of Birmingham passed anti-marching ordinances. The 16th Street Baptist Church there would be the center for the civil rights organizers, and they vowed to defy the local laws and march anyway. In May of 1963, Bull Connor ordered the police department in Birmingham to break up these civil rights marches, using force if necessary, and they generally considered it necessary. And he even ordered the fire department to use their hoses on marchers to stop the protest. Fire hoses were so powerful that they could strip the bark off of trees and frequently shedded the clothing of protesters and certainly could cause injury. Police dogs were also called in to attack demonstrators. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, led by Martin Luther King, made the controversial decision to place children on the front lines in order to increase media publicity. The Birmingham riots quickly became international news, hurting America's image both at home and abroad. And JFK eventually had to send in troops to protect civil rights marchers, especially after several black churches were firebombed and their leaders had their homes burned to the ground. One of the churches that was eventually firebombed was the 16th Street Baptist Church, where much of the organizing of the Birmingham campaign had taken place. It was attacked in September of 1963 and resulted in the deaths of 4 young girls aged 11 to 14. Now, a civil rights bill had been first introduced into Congress way back in 1955, actually introduced by Lyndon Johnson, who in 1963 was the vice president. It had been debated by Congress basically twice a year, but had never been passed because filibusters by Southern senators kept blocking a final vote. Well, in August of 1963, supporters organized a march on Washington. The purpose of the march, to put pressure on Congress to finally pass the stalled civil rights bill. It would include numerous civil rights groups, celebrities from Hollywood, as well as clergy from all faiths, people of all color and all walks of life, arrived in Washington by whatever means they could use to get there. More than 300,000 people showed up, and there they heard Martin Luther King, who was the featured speaker, give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which was delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of that old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And the law was eventually passed, though not until 1964. Turning to some other aspects of the civil rights movement, you had the issue of voting. For example, in Mississippi, only 2% of eligible black voters were registered to vote, and this was pretty typical across the South. Poll taxes were common to keep poor people from voting, and in a state like Mississippi, the poor were much more likely to be black. Of course, there were poor whites, but there were often charitable organizations that would pay the poll taxes for white voters. Literacy tests were also often used to prevent black voters from participating in the political process. Alabama was one example of a state that required a literacy test. And some states, like Tennessee, used what were labeled as grandfather clauses to prohibit blacks from voting. A grandfather clause will generally prohibit anyone from voting if their ancestors were ineligible to vote prior to 1867. And since the first mention of former slaves having the right to vote did not occur until the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, it's clear who was being targeted by these grandfather clauses, though technically it would apply to people who had immigrant ancestors as well. To address the issue in Mississippi and other states that used poll tax, the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was added in 1964, specifically prohibiting the collection of poll taxes, though literacy tests were outlawed by Supreme Court decision. Still, because of this clear denial of voting rights, Martin Luther King decided to bring attention to the issue, and he targeted the city of Selma in Alabama, hoping to register black voters there by conducting a march from Selma to the Capitol in Montgomery. He chose Selma specifically because of the reported temper of the sheriff, Jim Clark. The march to the Capitol was organized and led by King, who crossed what is known as the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what later came to be termed Bloody Sunday. Governor George Wallace called out the state police to block the march at the bridge, and when the crowd did not immediately disperse, ordered the horses to charge into the crowd and the police to beat marchers indiscriminately. It very much signaled an end to the nonviolent phase for many within this civil rights movement. During Johnson's administration, you definitely see a change in attitude about nonviolent protest. After what had happened in Birmingham and Selma, many black Americans, especially the younger group, decided that they needed to take more direct action, believing that the nonviolent movement had gone about as far as it could go, and that waiting any longer was simply not an option. Now was the time to become more confrontational, and so what was called the Black Power movement was born. In general, the Black Power movement had a goal of African Americans taking pride in their cultural heritage, instead of trying to be liked or to assimilate completely into white society. They wanted to focus on Black studies programs at school curriculum and focus on cultural history instead of just white political history. They embraced new terminology, new foods, and adopted the raised, clenched fist as a symbol of Black power. To support the movement, Black student unions began popping up at college campuses nationwide. Within this movement, there would be numerous organizations, including the Black Muslims, also known as the Nation of Islam, that was founded by the son of a Georgia sharecropper named Elijah Poole, who, as he put it, dropped his slave name and became known as Elijah Muhammad. In addition to the basic beliefs of the Islamic religion, he added several of his own beliefs, including that Jews were to blame for the poverty-stricken conditions of many blacks, that it was blacks that were the real chosen people of God, that all white people were put on earth to tempt black men down, and that all the problems encountered by blacks were the fault of the white race. Everything from poverty to disease to unemployment to the lack of an adequate education. Elijah Muhammad, however, was not a particularly charismatic speaker, and found that gifted orator in a man named Malcolm Little. He was known as a fiery, impassioned speaker who had grown up on the streets of Harlem and converted to Islam. And he, too, dropped his original last name and instead simply became known as Malcolm X. He believed especially in the idea of black nationalism, a combination of black self-reliance, the idea of refusing to be a victim, even the creation of a separate black America. Unlike Martin Luther King's turn the other cheek nonviolent philosophy, black nationalists such as Malcolm X believed in countering white violence with black violence, and many began training for what they believed was an inevitable race war in America. But in 1964, Malcolm X went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, where he saw many light-skinned and even blue-eyed Arabs praying to the same God he did. And when he returned to the United States, he broke away from Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam, establishing his own mosque in Harlem. Not long afterwards, Malcolm X effectively was becoming more well-known, even more respected than Elijah Muhammad, at which time 3 members of the Nation of Islam, following the orders of Louis Farrakhan, assassinated Malcolm X in 1965, though no charges would ever be brought against either Elijah Muhammad or Louis Farrakhan for their role in Malcolm X's assassination. Because of the rise in the Black Power movement coincided with an increase in violence, many in America began to place blame on this Black Power movement, both the leadership and the members itself, blaming them for the violence that was occurring in the United States, some of which actually had nothing to do with the Black Power movement at all. For example, in the summer of 1965, a man by the name of Marquette Fry was stopped by police in the Watts section of Los Angeles on suspicion of DUI. He was right near his home, and his mother and brother approached officers and tried to get the car released rather than being impounded. Her screams attracted a crowd that surrounded the police car. Rocks and bottles would be thrown as both mother and sons were arrested. Rumors about violence by the police towards Mrs. Fry and others spread rapidly. Within 2 hours, the crowd had become an angry mob, overturning parked cars, attacking passers-by, and smashing storefront windows, which then led to looting, which initially targeted hardware and furniture stores, even a television repair shop. Even the local supermarket shelves would eventually be stripped bare, and many fires would be started. The Watts riots continued for several more days, with up to 5,000 people participating in the rioting and the looting of 12 square miles of South Central Los Angeles. Governor Pat Brown of California called out the state's National Guard, setting a curfew and even issuing orders for the Guard to shoot to kill any suspected looters. Once order was eventually restored, it was discovered that 34 people had been killed, more than 1,000 had been injured, more than 3,000 people had been arrested, and there was more than $220 million in damage to private property. But there was no proof that the Black Power movement had anything whatsoever to do with it. In fact, an investigation into the cause of the Watts riots determined that it was primarily poverty and racism that was at the root of the violence. But the violence wasn't just here in Los Angeles. It was also occurring elsewhere in the country. The violent events in Birmingham and Selma were just an example. And you would also see the violence spreading to northern cities. Martin Luther King, for example, tried to take his nonviolent strategy to the north to see if his actions could work better up there. He was in Chicago, and there he and his followers were met by thousands of angry white people, mostly the descendants of European immigrants who had flocked to the suburbs after World War II. And they would be targeted, with King himself even saying, "Never before in my life, not in Birmingham or Selma, did he encounter such hatred and hostility as he had in Cicero outside of Chicago. You would see other race riots breaking out in places like Harlem in New York, Newark in New Jersey, Detroit in Michigan, many times police and National Guard having to be called out. And it often resulted in dozens of deaths or injuries, thousands upon thousands of buildings damaged and destroyed. But again, no evidence that the Black Power movement had anything to do with it. Another group that gets lumped into the Black Power movement was a newly established civil rights organization called the Black Panther Party. It was established by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California in 1964. Their slogan was "Power to the People," and they tried to give the people assistance where the government wasn't necessarily providing any. They set up a free breakfast program for school children in poor neighborhoods and set themselves apart from the rest of society, wearing black leather jackets, black berets, and dark sunglasses. And they even began following the police around in cars, arming themselves in the event of what they saw also as an inevitable race war. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover would eventually label the Black Panther Party as the greatest threat to the American way of life, and conducted a secret campaign to try and destroy them, launching attacks on more than 60 Black Panther headquarters all across the country. Several of the Black Panthers' leaders would be killed in the police shootouts, and others would go to jail, including both Huey Newton and Bobby Seale themselves. Soon other civil rights organizations began turning their backs on Martin Luther King's nonviolent strategy, including the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which by the mid-60s had adopted a much more radical philosophy. Their spokesman, Stokely Carmichael, wanted the civil rights movement to become specifically a black struggle. He wanted whites to get out of the movement altogether, for it to become black-staffed, black-controlled, and black-financed. Though many in America supported the actions of the SNCC, this position alienated many white liberals, and donations began to vanish. Still, groups like the SNCC believed that the riots and the violence was just a dress rehearsal for the big revolution that was on the way. Despite the division within the movement and increasing violence, Martin Luther King continued to promote peace. In early 1968, he went back to Memphis, Tennessee to lead a civil rights march supporting striking sanitation workers who were hoping to receive equal pay regardless of race. While standing outside his motel room, he was shot and killed by a local KKK member named James Earl Ray, who was then arrested 2 months later after a nationwide manhunt. His fingerprints were found on the gun that was used to kill King, and he had confessed while he was in custody, though he later recanted, claiming he'd been set up by the FBI. He was eventually convicted and received a sentence of 99 years, eventually dying in prison. As news of the assassination became public, though, many believed that the revolution had arrived, and riots erupted in scores of major cities nationwide. New York's lasting for 3 days, Detroit's for 6 days, forcing the United States Army to come in to stop the violence. Even Washington, D.C. experienced a major riot in the wake of King's assassination. Of course, the irony of the situation was that a man who had stood for nonviolence all of his life had, in his tragic death, triggered some of the biggest racial unrest to date. Stores and businesses were looted and burned, and people were injured by the thousands. And of course, there would be numerous conspiracy theories about King's assassination. But in the end, Ray served his time in prison until his death.